A full hegemony battalion was deployed to clear the area. They had air support, heavy artillery, specialized reconnaissance drones. They spent 3 weeks combing the mountains. They lost 8 walkers to terrain accidents, 4 more to geothermal incidents. They never made visual contact with a single enemy combatant. The only evidence of Wade was the occasional, faint transmission the signal corps would pick up. A burst of static that, when cleaned up, sounded like a man whistling an old folk tune. The resolution was a tactical humiliation. A single untrained man, armed with little more than a rifle, some climbing gear, and a lifetime of local knowledge, was inflicting more casualties and consuming more military resources than a conventional human army corps. He wasn't just hiding. He was demonstrating a form of warfare we had no counter for. He wasn't fighting the soldiers. He was fighting the land itself, and he had convinced the land to fight for him. The legend of the Ghost of Yellowstone spread through the occupation forces not as a rumor, but as a tactical briefing. It was a new kind of fear. Not the fear of a bullet, but the fear of the ground giving way beneath your feet. The fear that the very planet was hostile. This psychological impact would soon become a weapon in itself. They came to fight a war. Instead, they entered a state of perpetual, low-grade terror. The hegemony's doctrine was built for an enemy you could see, an enemy that held territory, an enemy that followed some form of recognizable military logic. Humanity offered none of that. The front line was everywhere, and nowhere. The first symptom was the breakdown of basic interaction. A soldier at a checkpoint would wave through a vehicle because the driver wore a hegemony-issued labor badge. That vehicle would then detonate at the inner gate. The local workers serving the morning nutrient paste were the same ones who had, the night before, rigged the filtration system in the officers' quarters to slowly release an odorless, paralyzing agent. You couldn't trust the food. You couldn't trust the air. You couldn't trust the mechanic who claimed your walker's gyro stabilizer just needed a routine calibration, especially when that walker would later tumble into a ravine during a routine patrol. The enemy didn't wear a uniform. They wore the face of a frightened civilian begging for water. They wore the face of a collaborator offering valuable intelligence. They wore the face of a maintenance technician whose security clearance was impeccably forged. This ambiguity was a weapon that never needed reloading. It forced every soldier into a constant, exhausting state of hypervigilance. Is that child carrying a message or a remote detonator? Is that pothole in the road just a pothole? Or is it a shaped charge disguised as asphalt? The cognitive load was immense. Decision fatigue set in within weeks. Command structure began to rot from the inside. Field officers, paranoid about infiltration, started issuing contradictory orders. They stopped trusting their own communications network, fearing human signal interception and manipulation. A platoon might receive orders to secure a bridge, only to find another platoon already there under orders to destroy it. This confusion wasn't accidental. It was engineered. The resistance exploited our command protocols, feeding us false data that turned our own efficiency against us. The sleep chambers became the ultimate symbol of this psychological defeat. These were meant to be sanctuaries, the one place a soldier could achieve the deep, restorative sleep their biology required. Then units began to be found dead in their pods. Not from violence, but from a total shutdown of their central nervous systems. The cause was traced to aerosolized compounds introduced into the air recyclers. The one place that was supposed to be safe became the most likely place to die. After that, sleep was impossible. Soldiers would fake their biometric readings to avoid entering the chambers, choosing utter exhaustion over the chance of never waking up. The resolution was quantitative and horrifying. The attrition rate from direct combat was eventually dwarfed by the attrition rate from psychological collapse. The official term was voluntary terminal disengagement. The rate reached 28%. Nearly a third of all casualties were soldiers who simply chose to end their own service and their lives because they could no longer withstand the relentless, invisible pressure. They weren't being defeated by bullets. They were being defeated by doubt. Their will to fight was systematically dismantled not by an army, but by an environment they could never secure. This erosion of morale created the perfect conditions for the next phase of the war, one that would strike not at the front lines, but at the very heart of our command. The infiltration was about to become far more personal. How do you get inside the enemy's head when their head is a kilometer-long capital ship in geosynchronous orbit? You don't blast your way in. You get a job there. The occupation force had a massive and complex fleet hovering over Earth. These ships required constant maintenance. Complex systems needed calibrating. Hull breaches needed welding. Internal conduits needed scrubbing of microscopic earth bacteria that clogged the filters. The solution was obvious and, from their perspective, efficient. Use human labor. The vetting process was a joke. A basic biological scan to confirm species. A retinal pattern check against a database of known insurgents. A work order issued. They saw a desperate population needing employment. They saw warm bodies to push brooms and carry toolkits. Their arrogance was a security clearance. Petra Novak held a master's degree in structural engineering and a deep, abiding hatred for the invaders who had flattened her university. Her file showed she was a former construction site supervisor. Perfect. She was assigned to a team servicing the primary drive coolant systems on the command carrier, Star Razor. Her team consisted of a welder, an electrician, and 2 general laborers. Their uniforms were standard Hegemony issue maintenance coveralls. Their IDs granted them access to every non-restricted deck. Maintenance crews are invisible. Officers and techs step around them. They are part of the scenery. They hear everything. They see everything. They are everywhere. For 3 months they did their jobs. They fixed coolant leaks. They replaced faulty wiring. They were punctual, efficient, and utterly unremarkable. All the while they mapped the ship. They learned the security patrol rotations. They identified the blind spots in the internal sensor coverage. They noted which access panels led to critical systems and which were just for show. They learned how to mimic the slight hunch, the averted gaze, the submissive posture that made them vanish into the background. They became ghosts in the machine, and the machine never noticed. The operation was not a single bomb. It was a symphony of sabotage timed to the second. On the designated day, they didn't report to their usual stations. They went to the locations they had mapped over months of tedious labor. One planted a shaped charge on the primary power coupling for the ventral weapons array. The explosive was molded to look like a standard vibration dampener. Another accessed the environmental control nexus and introduced a corrosive aerosol into the life support filtration intake. A third bypassed 3 separate security locks on an engineering terminal and uploaded a virus that would scramble the navigation coordinates during the next jump. The charges detonated simultaneously across 7 different capital ships. There were no grand fireballs. The attacks were surgical, precise, and devastating. The Star Razor's main drive sputtered and died, sending it into a slow drift out of orbit. 2 destroyers lost all primary weapon systems. A carrier's life support failed, forcing an emergency evacuation. The command and control network experienced a cascading systems failure that took hours to untangle. The resolution was a catastrophic breach of security. The humans hadn't infiltrated their command structure. They had become their command structure's support system. They had used the hegemony's own need for order, for efficiency, for cheap labor as the ultimate Trojan horse. The most secure vessels in the fleet were compromised not by force but by a maintenance request. This wasn't a cell of special forces. It was a handful of technicians who understood that sometimes the most powerful weapon is a wrench and the right access code. This tactic, this deep infiltration, proved that no aspect of the occupation was safe. The resistance wasn't just in the cities and the mountains. It was in the hallways. It was in the vents. It was fixing your coffee maker. This logic of turning everyday roles into weapons would soon filter down to the most unexpected corners of occupied society. This logic began to infect everything. Hegemony technology, once prized for its raw power, was retrofitted with human modifications. Weapon systems were given manual mechanical overrides. Life support included redundant, non-networked backups. Their tactics, built on predictable fleet engagements, absorbed human principles of misdirection, terrain exploitation, and asymmetric warfare. They were learning to fight like the enemy that had beaten them. Their efficiency increased. Their losses against the convergence began to drop. The student was teaching the master. The political concessions were the true measure of this new reality. The quarantine around Earth was lifted, not as a reward, as a necessity. Humanity's full integration into the galactic community was required to marshal its unique capabilities against the larger threat. Sovereignty was formally granted over its existing colonized systems. This was unprecedented. A species that had just achieved FTL travel was given recognized territorial control equal to established interstellar powers. Their claims were legitimized. Their colonies, mining outposts, research stations, military waypoints, became sovereign soil. The galactic map was redrawn overnight. The balance of power didn't just shift, it inverted. The hegemony, for all its remaining fleets and industrial might, was now dependent. Its survival hinged on a partnership with a species it had tried to exterminate. Humanity brought something to the table that couldn't be built in a shipyard: a chaotic, creative, and utterly ruthless adaptability. They were the unpredictable variable in every strategic calculation. The galaxy would never be the same. The old order, a hierarchy based on technological supremacy and clear military dominance, was finished. A new era began, built on a far more volatile and terrifying principle: that the most dangerous force in the universe is not the biggest gun, but the most adaptable mind. This new reality was watched with deep unease by every other species, who now had to contend with a power that played by an entirely different set of rules. The insights of one individual, a prisoner of war, had predicted this outcome long before the generals would admit it. The prisoner sat in the dark, but she saw everything. Analyst Nex Lara wasn't kept in a cell. She was kept at a terminal, her data port wired directly into the resistance network. They wanted her to see. They wanted her to understand. Her initial reports were professional, detached. Tactical assessments. Then the tone changed. Her analysis shifted from cataloging our losses to documenting their methods. She watched their psychological warfare. She tracked the soldier self-termination rates, the paranoia that infected command, the slow grinding erosion of unit cohesion. She noted it wasn't the explosions that broke the hegemony. It was the silence between them. It was the constant, gnawing uncertainty about the next attack, the next betrayal, the next poisoned meal. She saw the 28% casualty rate from soldiers who simply chose to end it. She understood that a military that cannot trust its own environment has already lost. She documented their innovation. She compiled files on how industrial cleaning supplies became high explosives, how grandmothers with chemistry textbooks became bomb makers, how a wildlife guide in a remote park became a tactical nightmare. She saw the pattern. It wasn't random chaos. It was directed, adaptive, and brutally efficient creativity. They weren't just resisting. They were learning, evolving, and perfecting their methods in real time. Her analysis predicted the stalemate long before command would admit it. She projected the casualty curves. She mapped the unsustainable resource drain. She argued that conventional victory was impossible against an enemy that turned our own supply lines and technology against us. Her reports were marked as alarmist. They were filed away and ignored. She was a prisoner, after all. What could she know? But she recognized the convergence threat before anyone in high command. Her analysis of the first sensor ghosts, the first lost colonies, was immediate and terrifyingly accurate. She identified it as an existential threat that required a fundamental shift in strategy. Her earlier warnings gave her analysis weight. She had been right about the humans. She was right about this. Her insights became the foundation for the Alliance decision. Her captured reports, her psychological profiles of humanity, her cold, clear cost-benefit analysis, were circulated at the highest levels of the hegemony command. She provided the intellectual framework to justify what seemed like insanity, joining forces with the enemy that had humiliated them. She made the unpalatable logical. The resolution was her final report, submitted from captivity. She concluded that humanity's hidden fleet wasn't a physical armada waiting in some distant nebula. It was their collective, chaotic, and unstoppable will. Their hidden fleet was their adaptability. It was their ability to turn a delivery truck into a weapon, a maintenance job into an infiltration, a kitchen into an armory. It was their cultural memory of surviving against impossible odds. This was the asset the galaxy needed. This was the only thing that could save us all from the convergence. The prisoner didn't just see our defeat. She saw the only path to our collective survival, and she had the clarity to write it down. This new understanding of power would force a final galactic-wide reckoning with what strength truly means. The war wasn't won with our weapons. It was won with their wiring. The Alliance codified a new galactic reality, one where the old metrics of power were suddenly obsolete. Our battle fleet's tonnage, its energy output, its number of capital ships, these things no longer guaranteed victory. They just made you a bigger, slower target for an enemy who saw your own technology as a kit of parts for their next weapon. The security framework we built together was based on one principle: expect everything to fail and plan for that. We learned. The hegemony didn't just gain a partner, it gained an inoculation against its own predictability. We brought our industrial capacity, our fleet, our knowledge of deep space. They brought their chaotic, brilliant, and utterly ruthless adaptability. They looked at our sleek, powerful warships and saw vulnerabilities we had engineered out millennia ago. They pointed out that a networked targeting system is a single point of failure. They suggested manual, hardwired overrides. They redesigned our boarding protocols based on their experience infiltrating our own vessels. It was humiliating. It was also incredibly effective. Every other species in the galactic community watched this and started running their own calculations. Military doctrines that had stood for 10,000 years were suddenly open for debate. Diplomats began to study human history, not for cultural curiosity, but for tactical insight. They wanted to understand the mindset that could turn a food shipment into a bomb. The balance of power didn't shift. It dissolved into a fluid, unpredictable state, where the smallest, most innovative species could now pose a credible threat to the largest. The convergence threat was the ultimate test. It proved the new framework wasn't just theoretical. Our combined fleet engagements were still failing. Their bioships adapted to our energy weapons, regenerated from our attacks. Then the human-modified squadrons engaged. They didn't use plasma. They used mass drivers. They fired simple tungsten rods at relativistic speeds. The organic ships couldn't dissipate kinetic energy. They ruptured. They hemorrhaged. It was a solution so simple, so low-tech. We had dismissed it as primitive. It worked. Earth's status changed overnight. It went from a pacification target to a sovereign power, from a quarry to a quartermaster. The quarantine was lifted not as a reward, but as a strategic necessity. We needed their thinkers. We needed their chaotic, non-linear approach to problem-solving. They became consultants on survival. The galaxy learned the hardest lesson a dominant power can learn. True strength isn't about having the most advanced technology. It's about having the most adaptable mindset. It's the ability to look at a defeat and see a lesson, to look at a tool and see a weapon, to look at an ally and see a resource. Our technological superiority had made us rigid. Their technological inferiority had forced them to become fluid. And in a universe full of unknown threats, flexibility will always beat sheer force. This fundamental redefinition of power left the entire galactic community with a single, lingering, and deeply unsettling question about their new partners. The war is over. The alliance is in effect, but the galaxy isn't celebrating. It's watching. There's a single unsettling question hanging over every council session, every joint operation. Did our invasion force awaken a monster on Earth? Or did it simply step on a nest and reveal what was always there, waiting in the dark? Humanity's true nature is the galaxy's biggest unanswered strategic variable. Their adaptability saved us from the convergence. It's also the thing that keeps alien admirals awake during the night cycle. When does knowledge stop being domestic and start becoming a combat manual? The hegemony controlled the physical infrastructure of the cities, the roads, the power grids, the administration buildings. They did not control the information flowing through them. They saw a pacified, occupied populace. They failed to see the world's largest, most distributed university for unconventional warfare operating right under their scanners. Their greatest miscalculation was assuming ignorance. Humanity's greatest weapon was its collective memory and its willingness to share it. The Internet archives were not erased. They were simply ignored, deemed irrelevant cultural artifacts. These archives contain thousands of texts on historical guerrilla campaigns, the Viet Cong's tunnel systems, the French Resistance's sabotage techniques. Every successful underdog conflict in human history was cataloged, analyzed, and available for download. A citizen could study the IRA's methods for constructing roadside explosives from fertilizer on their phone while waiting in a ration line. A shopkeeper could access PDFs of declassified OSS manuals on silent assassination from a hidden terminal in his basement. This wasn't a secret library. It was a public one. The knowledge was there for anyone with the will to use it. Chemistry textbooks became the new arsenal. A chapter on common household chemicals wasn't just academic. It was a recipe. Ammonium nitrate from fertilizer, sugar and potassium chlorate from stump remover, glycerin from soap-making supplies. The instructions were clear, the ingredients available at any corner store or in any garden shed. A grandmother in Krakow could follow a diagram from a high school chemistry book and produce a stable, powerful explosive using cleaning supplies she had under her sink. Her measuring cups became her calibrators. Her oven set on low became her chemical reactor. The scanners at checkpoints looked for guns, for military-grade plastique. They never thought to run a spectral analysis on a jar of homemade preserves or a bag of laundry powder. Social media platforms, once for sharing family photos, became the Resistance's central nervous system. Coded messages and recipe comments. Instructional videos on bomb-making disguised as artisan soap-making tutorials. A picture of a beautiful flower arrangement could contain a steganographic map of a patrol schedule, decipherable with a free app. The information spread faster than any counterintelligence unit could track it. A new tactic developed in a São Paulo favela would be weaponized in a Seoul apartment complex within hours. The network was leaderless, agile, and ruthlessly efficient. Children became the eyes and ears. They were small, fast, and universally underestimated. A game of jump rope near a checkpoint was a perfect surveillance operation. A ball kicked over a fence was a perfect distraction. They carried messages in their pockets, memorized codes, and served as an early warning system that no electronic sensor could jam. The entire community was integrated, from the oldest to the youngest. There were no civilians. There were only combatants in different roles. The resolution was a fundamental rewriting of the battlefield's perimeter. The front line was now the kitchen counter. The armory was the garden shed. The command center was a grandmother's living room, where she carefully measured powdered chemicals while a children's cartoon played on the screen. The hegemony's control of territory became a meaningless statistic. They held the ground, but the people on that ground had turned their own homes, their own daily routines, into a distributed weapons factory. This total societal mobilization presented a strategic problem with no clear military solution. Controlling a city's central plaza meant nothing if every apartment building surrounding it was a potential bomb factory. The concept of control itself was becoming a paradox. What does it mean to control territory without controlling the population? The difference is everything. The hegemony held every major city. Their flags flew over every capitol building. Their garrison troops patrolled the streets. Their walkers stood guard on strategic bridges. By every conventional metric, they controlled the ground. But the people on that ground had not been conquered. They had merely been inconvenienced. This disparity created a strategic illusion of control that masked a devastating reality. Their supply lines became extravagant military operations in themselves. A convoy of food and medicine required 2 platoons of walkers as escort. Every truck, every transport, every fuel tanker was a liability. The route from a spaceport to a city garrison took 5 times longer than it should have, as engineers swept every meter of road for improvised explosives and patrols, cleared overpasses and side streets of potential ambushes. The cost in fuel, manpower, and time was astronomical. The very act of sustaining their occupation was draining their resources faster than any battle. Commanders became prisoners in their own fortresses. The commanding officer of the European sector never left his bunker complex outside Paris. His intelligence came from drone feeds and reports filtered through a paranoid chain of command. He couldn't walk the streets he supposedly controlled. He couldn't assess the morale of his own troops firsthand. He commanded a map, not a territory. This isolation bred disastrous miscalculations. Decisions were made based on flawed data and a complete misreading of the local environment. Communication was a nightmare. Every transmission was suspect. Encrypted channels were assumed to be compromised. Hardwired landlines were found to be tapped. The resistance used everything from hacked satellite phones to children running handwritten notes. The hegemony's command structure, designed for speed and clarity, descended into a fog of confusion and mistrust. Orders were delayed. Situational reports were contradictory. A simple request for reinforcements could take hours to verify and execute, by which time the unit requesting them was often already gone. Local collaborators were neutralized with terrifying speed and finality. A shopkeeper who sold information to the occupation forces would be found the next morning with a single, precise bullet wound and a sign around his neck labeling him a traitor. The message was clear and effective. Cooperation meant death. This created a wall of silence and hostility that no amount of technological superiority could penetrate. The hegemony's intelligence apparatus reliant on local informants withered and died. The occupation became an economic black hole. The cost in resources and casualties was no longer sustainable. They were spending billions to control assets that provided no return, and cities that actively consumed their military strength. Every square kilometer of controlled territory was a net loss. They weren't pacifying a planet. They were feeding it their entire military budget, one ambushed convoy and one sabotaged base at a time. This logic began to infect everything. Hegemony technology, once prized for its raw power, was retrofitted with human modifications. Weapons systems were given manual mechanical overrides. Life support included redundant, non-networked backups. Their tactics, built on predictable fleet engagements, absorbed human principles of misdirection, terrain exploitation, and asymmetric warfare. They were learning to fight like the enemy that had beaten them. Their efficiency increased. Their losses against the convergence began to drop. The student was teaching the master. The political concessions were the true measure of this new reality. The quarantine around Earth was lifted, not as a reward, as a necessity. Humanity's full integration into the galactic community was required to marshal its unique capabilities against the larger threat. Sovereignty was formally granted over its existing colonized systems. This was unprecedented. A species that had just achieved FTL travel was given recognized territorial control equal to established interstellar powers. Their claims were legitimized. Their colonies, mining outposts, research stations, military waypoints, became sovereign soil. The galactic map was redrawn overnight. The balance of power didn't just shift, it inverted. The hegemony, for all its remaining fleets and industrial might, was now dependent. Its survival hinged on a partnership with a species it had tried to exterminate. Humanity brought something to the table that couldn't be built in a shipyard: a chaotic, creative, and utterly ruthless adaptability. They were the unpredictable variable in every strategic calculation. The galaxy would never be the same. The old order, a hierarchy based on technological supremacy and clear military dominance, was finished. A new era began, built on a far more volatile and terrifying principle: that the most dangerous force in the universe is not the biggest gun, but the most adaptable mind. This new reality was watched with deep unease by every other species, who now had to contend with a power that played by an entirely different set of rules. The insights of one individual, a prisoner of war, had predicted this outcome long before the generals would admit it. The prisoner sat in the dark, but she saw everything. Analyst Nex Lara wasn't kept in a cell. She was kept at a terminal, her data port wired directly into the resistance network. They wanted her to see. They wanted her to understand. Her initial reports were professional, detached. Tactical assessments. Then the tone changed. Her analysis shifted from cataloging our losses to documenting their methods. She watched their psychological warfare. She tracked the soldier self-termination rates, the paranoia that infected command, the slow grinding erosion of unit cohesion. She noted it wasn't the explosions that broke the hegemony. It was the silence between them. It was the constant, gnawing uncertainty about the next attack, the next betrayal, the next poisoned meal. She saw the 28% casualty rate from soldiers who simply chose to end it. She understood that a military that cannot trust its own environment has already lost. She documented their innovation. She compiled files on how industrial cleaning supplies became high explosives, how grandmothers with chemistry textbooks became bomb makers, how a wildlife guide in a remote park became a tactical nightmare. She saw the pattern. It wasn't random chaos. It was directed, adaptive, and brutally efficient creativity. They weren't just resisting. They were learning, evolving, and perfecting their methods in real time. Her analysis predicted the stalemate long before command would admit it. She projected the casualty curves. She mapped the unsustainable resource drain. She argued that conventional victory was impossible against an enemy that turned our own supply lines and technology against us. Her reports were marked as alarmist. They were filed away and ignored. She was a prisoner, after all. What could she know? But she recognized the convergence threat before anyone in high command. Her analysis of the first sensor ghosts, the first lost colonies, was immediate and terrifyingly accurate. She identified it as an existential threat that required a fundamental shift in strategy. Her earlier warnings gave her analysis weight. She had been right about the humans. She was right about this. Her insights became the foundation for the Alliance decision. Her captured reports, her psychological profiles of humanity, her cold, clear cost-benefit analysis, were circulated at the highest levels of the Hegemony Command. She provided the intellectual framework to justify what seemed like insanity, joining forces with the enemy that had humiliated them. She made the unpalatable logical. The resolution was her final report, submitted from captivity. She concluded that humanity's hidden fleet wasn't a physical armada waiting in some distant nebula. It was their collective, chaotic, and unstoppable will. Their hidden fleet was their adaptability. It was their ability to turn a delivery truck into a weapon, a maintenance job into an infiltration, a kitchen into an armory. It was their cultural memory of surviving against impossible odds. This was the asset the galaxy needed. This was the only thing that could save us all from the convergence. The prisoner didn't just see our defeat. She saw the only path to our collective survival, and she had the clarity to write it down. This new understanding of power would force a final galactic-wide reckoning with what strength truly means. The war wasn't won with our weapons. It was won with their wiring. The Alliance codified a new galactic reality, one where the old metrics of power were suddenly obsolete. A battle fleet's tonnage, its energy output, its number of capital ships, these things no longer guaranteed victory. They just made you a bigger, slower target for an enemy who saw your own technology as a kit of parts for their next weapon. The security framework we built together was based on one principle: expect everything to fail and plan for that. We learned. The hegemony didn't just gain a partner, it gained an inoculation against its own predictability. We brought our industrial capacity, our fleet, our knowledge of deep space. They brought their chaotic, brilliant, and utterly ruthless adaptability. They looked at our sleek, powerful warships and saw vulnerabilities we had engineered out millennia ago. They pointed out that a networked targeting system is a single point of failure. They suggested manual, hardwired overrides. They redesigned our boarding protocols based on their experience infiltrating our own vessels. It was humiliating. It was also incredibly effective. Every other species in the galactic community watched this and started running their own calculations. Military doctrines that had stood for 10,000 years were suddenly open for debate. Diplomats began to study human history, not for cultural curiosity, but for tactical insight. They wanted to understand the mindset that could turn a food shipment into a bomb. The balance of power didn't shift. It dissolved into a fluid, unpredictable state, where the smallest, most innovative species could now pose a credible threat to the largest. The convergence threat was the ultimate test. It proved the new framework wasn't just theoretical. Our combined fleet engagements were still failing. Their bioships adapted to our energy weapons, regenerated from our attacks. Then the human-modified squadrons engaged. They didn't use plasma. They used mass drivers. They fired simple tungsten rods at relativistic speeds. The organic ships couldn't dissipate kinetic energy. They ruptured. They hemorrhaged. It was a solution so simple, so low-tech, we had dismissed it as primitive. It worked. Earth's status changed overnight. It went from a pacification target to a sovereign power, from a quarry to a quartermaster. The quarantine was lifted not as a reward, but as a strategic necessity. We needed their thinkers. We needed their chaotic, non-linear approach to problem-solving. They became consultants on survival. The galaxy learned the hardest lesson a dominant power can learn. True strength isn't about having the most advanced technology. It's about having the most adaptable mindset. It's the ability to look at a defeat and see a lesson, to look at a tool and see a weapon, to look at an ally and see a resource. Our technological superiority had made us rigid. Their technological inferiority had forced them to become fluid. And in a universe full of unknown threats, flexibility will always beat sheer force. This fundamental redefinition of power left the entire galactic community with a single, lingering, and deeply unsettling question about their new partners. The war is over. The Alliance is in effect, but the galaxy isn't celebrating. It's watching. There's a single unsettling question hanging over every council session, every joint operation. Did our invasion force awaken a monster on Earth? Or did it simply step on a nest and reveal what was always there, waiting in the dark? Humanity's true nature is the galaxy's biggest unanswered strategic variable. Their adaptability saved us from the convergence. It's also the thing that keeps alien admirals awake during the night cycle. The resolution was a bitter strategic truth. Holding every major city meant the hegemony controlled nothing of strategic value. The real value, the loyalty of the population, the security of supply lines, the freedom to maneuver, was entirely in the hands of the resistance. They owned the buildings but not the people inside them. They owned the roads but could not travel them safely. This paradox of control shattered the confidence of the high command, creating a crisis of leadership that would force a fundamental reassessment of their entire campaign. Security is a state of mind. You lock the door, you post the guard, you run the scan, you feel safe. The hegemony believed their ships and bases were the ultimate secure zones, impenetrable fortresses of order in a chaotic world. Their doctrine was built on this assumption. A soldier could let his guard down inside the wire. The reality was that humans had stopped trying to break down the doors. They had started rewiring the locks from the inside, turning sanctuaries into instruments of psychological torture. It began with the stimulant dispensers. Every ship had them. Troops needed chemical assistance to maintain alertness during long watches. The systems were sealed, supposedly tamper-proof. They weren't. A maintenance worker with the right access and a vial of a custom neurotoxin could introduce it into the supply. A soldier would take his legal dose to stay sharp. Instead of clarity, he got seizures, paralysis, or a slow, creeping dementia that doctors couldn't diagnose. The very thing meant to ensure combat readiness became a random death lottery. The air filtration systems were next. They were designed to scrub contaminants, to keep the environment pure. Humans used that function against them. They introduced odorless, aerosolized compounds designed to trigger primal fear responses. There was no chemical signature to detect. One moment a squad bay would be calm. The next, a wave of inexplicable, brainstem-level terror would sweep through the compartment. Soldiers would open fire on shadows, on their own reflections, on each other. They'd wake up hours later with no memory of the event, surrounded by the casualties they themselves had created. The sleep chambers were the final sanctuary, and thus, the ultimate target. These were where soldiers went to regenerate, to dream, to escape the stress of the occupation. Subliminal messages were embedded into the white noise generators, not complex instructions, simple, repetitive phrases in the hegemony tongue. You are not safe. Your officers have betrayed you. The human is behind you. The mind, in its most vulnerable state, absorbed these messages as truth. Soldiers woke up screaming. They woke up paranoid. They woke up and immediately discharged their weapons into the ceiling. The one place meant for rest became a factory for insanity. Command confusion was engineered with surgical precision. Fabricated orders perfectly mimicking command protocols would be sent to field units. A captain would receive orders to retreat from a secured position. A logistics officer would be told to redirect a supply convoy into a known ambush zone. The constant low-grade fog of war that already existed was amplified into a screaming hurricane of misinformation. Officers began to doubt every transmission. They second-guessed every command. Initiative froze solid under the weight of this manufactured uncertainty. The result was a military force that trusted nothing and no one. A soldier looked at his squad mate and wondered if he'd been compromised. An officer looked at a direct order from high command and assumed it was a human trick. The fabric of unit cohesion, the absolute bedrock of any effective military, unraveled thread by thread. The resolution was a command corps paralyzed by its own fear. Generals on capital ships started demanding personal food tasters. They had their own bodyguards scan their quarters for listening devices every hour. They were ruling over a military that was, for all practical purposes, no longer functional. The psychological battlefield had no front line. It was inside their own heads, and they were losing. This internal collapse would soon force them to make a series of desperate, catastrophic decisions regarding their most vital assets, turning their own technology into their greatest liability. Weapons are expensive to build. Supply lines are complex to maintain. The hegemony's strategic advantage was their ability to move massive amounts of material and personnel across the globe and into orbit. Their dropships, transports, and supply vessels were the arteries of their occupation. They saw these assets as symbols of their logistical superiority. They failed to see them as the single most attractive, high-value target for an enemy that specialized in repurposing tools. It started with battlefield salvage. A hegemony dropship would be disabled by a lucky shot or a terrain trap, crash landing in a remote area. Recovery teams would be delayed by ambushes or redirected to more pressing emergencies. That left the wreckage and its technology in human hands for hours, sometimes days. They didn't try to reverse engineer the drives or the weapons. They went for the access codes and the transponder signals. A captured dropship patched up just enough to fly could be loaded with high explosives, its IFF signal spoofed to show it as a friendly vessel returning to a carrier. It would be granted landing clearance, touch down in a hangar bay full of other aircraft and personnel, and then detonate. The psychological impact was colossal. Their own safe space, their own technology, had been turned into a missile aimed directly at their heart. Supply vessels suffered the same fate. A cargo ship carrying reactor parts from orbit to a ground base would be hijacked, not by force but by deception. The human crew working under duress would transmit a false distress signal, reporting a minor systems failure. When a maintenance tender approached to assist, it would be boarded and seized. The cargo ship, now under resistance control, would then continue its journey, but its cargo hold no longer carried spare parts. It carried armed insurgents, missile launchers, and fresh supplies for local cells. The hegemon's own logistics network was being used to resupply the enemy. The most insidious attacks came from within. Maintenance crews, the same ones who had infiltrated the capital ships, performed subtle, delayed action sabotage on vehicles before they were even deployed. A dropship's gravitic stabilizer would be misaligned by a fraction of a degree. The flaw wouldn't show up on pre-flight diagnostics. It would only manifest under high-stress combat maneuvers, causing the vessel to veer violently into a cliff face or another aircraft. A Walker's joint actuator would be packed with an abrasive compound instead of lubricant. It would function normally for its first 50 kilometers of operation, before seizing up completely, stranding the multi-ton machine in the middle of hostile territory. This created an operational paralysis. Every piece of equipment was suspect. A new dropship fresh off the assembly line on a hegemony world had to be torn apart and reassembled by verified crews upon arrival. A routine supply run required a security detachment larger than the cargo itself. The trust in their own systems was gone. The cost in time, resources, and morale was unsustainable. Their greatest asset, their mobility, had become their greatest vulnerability. They couldn't move without risking a catastrophic incident caused by their own hardware. The resolution was a strategic defeat built on a simple, horrifying premise. The humans had stopped trying to match their technology. They had started using it against them. They turned the hegemon's own ships into bombs, their supply lines into infiltration routes, and their maintenance protocols into a blueprint for sabotage. The element of surprise was total, because the threat came from within their own order of battle. This level of penetration demonstrated a capability that went far beyond terrestrial resistance. It showed an understanding of alien technology and psychology that would soon attract the alarmed attention of powers far beyond the Earth's atmosphere. The galaxy was watching, and what it saw was terrifying. When does a resistance movement stop being a local conflict and start being a galactic-level contagion? The Galactic Security Council watched the Earth invasion as a routine policing action. A dominant interstellar power putting down a primitive upstart. Standard procedure. Then they saw a Walker-class unit immobilized not by a missile, but by a geothermal vent. They saw a capital ship's life support fail because of a maintenance worker with a vial of poison. They saw supply convoys vanish on roads that were supposed to be secure. This wasn't resistance. This was a live demonstration of a new form of warfare, and every species on the council felt a cold dread settle in. That single engagement changed the calculus. Our pride was a luxury we could no longer afford. Our survival required their ingenuity. Their survival required our industrial capacity and our knowledge of the wider galaxy. The hatred was still there. The memory of 9 million dead. The bitterness of defeat. But it was overshadowed by the cold, stark reality of the convergence. An enemy that made our previous conflict look like a minor border skirmish. We needed each other. Not as conqueror and conquered. As desperate allies staring into the same abyss. The resolution was a quiet, grim meeting in a neutral system. No flags, no fanfare. Just two delegations, their mutual loathing palpable, acknowledging a truth neither wanted to face. The alliance was born not from friendship, but from shared terror. The humans brought their chaotic, unpredictable adaptability. We brought our fleet. It was the only move left, the only chance either of us had. This new partnership would immediately be tested, and it would hinge on a human advantage we had once dismissed as a primitive weakness. Their minds. Their messy, chaotic, gloriously unpredictable minds. How do you win a war you've never fought before? You don't, you find one you have. The Hegemony's greatest technological advantage was its ignorance of human history. They scanned for weapons, not libraries. They analyzed troop movements, not cultural memory. They had no concept of a species that kept meticulous public records of every single conflict it had ever fought, won, or lost. Humanity's strategic advantage wasn't a hidden fleet. It was its browser history. When their cities fell, they didn't start from scratch. They opened a search bar. The Internet archives were a living database of proven tactics. A resistance cell in Marseille could download a PDF scan of a Viet Cong field manual on tunnel construction and apply it to the city's sewer system. A militia in the Rocky Mountains could study the tactical maps from the Soviet-Afghan conflict and replicate ambushes in the mountain passes. These weren't theoretical texts. They were after-action reports. They were instruction manuals written in blood and tested in real combat. The solutions weren't new. They were just new to us. The narratives were just as powerful as the tactics. Every culture had its story of the underdog victory. David and Goliath, the American revolutionaries, the Vietnamese farmers. These weren't just stories. They were psychological blueprints for resistance. They provided a template for how to think when you are outgunned, outnumbered, and outclassed. They taught that victory wasn't about matching force with force. It was about redefining the terms of the fight entirely. This cultural memory maintained morale at a level that made no logical sense. 1 billion casualties should have broken a species. For humanity, it was just a tragic chapter in a very long book of tragic chapters. They had been here before. They knew how it ended. This collective knowledge base created an ecosystem of rapid innovation. A new tactic developed in a basement in Berlin would be filmed on a phone, uploaded to a secure server, and weaponized in a market in Jakarta within hours. There was no central command to decapitate. There was only a network, a hive mind of historical knowledge and real-time experimentation. A grandmother in Ohio could watch a video on making thermite from iron oxide and aluminum powder, both ingredients readily available at any hardware store, and produce a compound that could burn through a walker's armor plate. Her knowledge came from a chemistry forum. Her inspiration came from a documentary about World War II resistance fighters. The resolution was a strategic paradigm we couldn't combat. Their secret weapon was accessibility. Every civilian with a charged cell phone and a data connection had instant access to centuries of combat knowledge, guerrilla strategy, and weapons manufacturing techniques. We were fighting a military. They were fighting with the collective intellectual heritage of their entire violent, brilliant, stubborn species. This deep well of historical precedent meant they were never truly surprised. They were never truly without options. For every new weapon we deployed, they had a dozen historical case studies on how to defeat it. This foundational advantage would soon be channeled not through a rifle sight, but across a negotiation table, where a single human expression would reframe the entire conflict. The negotiation chamber was silent. No flags, no honor guards, just a table and the bitter weight of 9 million dead. Ambassador Powell sat across from the Hegemony High Command. He didn't bring data slates or weapon schematics. He brought a single sentence. He looked at the conquerors of 12 galaxies and said, "You came here to add a planet to your collection. We fought to keep our species from becoming a footnote in your history." That was it. The entire conflict distilled into a difference of intent. The tension in the room wasn't about terms or border agreements. It was about fundamental misunderstanding. They had analyzed our tactics, our logistics, our weapons. They had never analyzed our motivation. Conquest is a political objective. It has limits. It has cost-benefit analyses. Survival is a biological imperative. It does not. You cannot negotiate with a bear in a trap. You can only understand why it is willing to chew its own leg off to get free. Powell's statement wasn't an accusation. It was a translation. He was explaining the rules of a game they never knew they were playing. This reframing changed everything. The Hegemony's staggering losses were no longer a measure of human brutality. They were a measure of human commitment. Our unpredictable tactics were no longer seen as chaotic. They were seen as evidence of a relentless, focused creativity aimed at a single goal: endure. The alliance, which moments before seemed like a humiliation, began to look like the only logical outcome. You don't try to exterminate a force with that level of dedication. You find a way to point it at your enemies. Then Powell smiled. It wasn't a smile of victory. It wasn't a gloat. It was a dry, pragmatic, utterly human expression. It said, "We have spent years finding new ways to kill each other. The cost has been astronomical for both sides. That chapter is over. Now we have a larger problem. We can continue this until we are both extinct, or we can do something more useful with our time." The smile was a signal, a nonverbal addendum to the truce. It was the visual representation of our adaptability. We could shift from total war to total cooperation in the space of a heartbeat if the situation demanded it. Our resilience was our flexibility. The hegemony leadership saw it. They recognized the strategic advantage immediately. This wasn't a defeated enemy begging for terms. This was a potential partner offering a unique skill set, a species that could turn delivery trucks into bombs and grandmothers into bomb makers, could probably figure out how to defeat an existential psychic threat from beyond the galaxy. The partnership was born not from forgiveness but from cold, mutual interest. The war ended not with a treaty signature, but with the understanding that a smile conveyed. The principle was simple, almost childishly so. Survival will always outlast conquest. The will to live will always be stronger than the desire to possess. This redefinition of the relationship would force a complete reorganization of power across known space. How do you rebuild galactic power structures when the foundation itself has cracked? The Alliance forced a complete reevaluation of every assumption the galaxy had operated under for millennia. Humanity's designation shifted in official reports, its file moving from a red-bordered Class 5 extinction threat to a new, previously non-existent category: essential strategic partner. The pariah had become the guest of honor. Phoenix Station was the physical embodiment of this shift. It was a joint military installation, but its design was pure human logic. The hegemony built ships and stations as displays of power, vast, symmetrical, interconnected. A single beautiful machine. Phoenix Station was the opposite. It was a collection of compartments, a maze. Its core principle was compartmentalization. Any single section could be sealed off, vented, or even self-destructed without compromising the whole. It was an architectural philosophy born from having your cities crushed. Its primary defense wasn't its shields. It was its redundancy. It expected to be breached. It was designed to survive that breach. The hegemony's engineers studied the blueprints with a kind of horrified admiration. It was the most paranoid, resilient structure ever built. It was perfect. This isn't about weapons or ships. It's about capability. The same chaotic creativity that turned delivery trucks into bombs and won a war against a superior foe could just as easily be turned against a new opponent. Or an ally. Their psychological operations didn't just break our soldiers' morale. They demonstrated a profound understanding of how to dismantle a mind. That knowledge doesn't just vanish when a treaty is signed. It's a permanent part of their arsenal. Other species look at humanity and don't see a partner. They see a master of a form of warfare that has no rules, no front lines, and no obvious counter. The Class 5 extinction threat designation wasn't an overreaction. It was a cold, logical assessment of an unprecedented variable. It reflected a genuine and ongoing fear that the human potential for unpredictable violence might be limitless, that their willingness to do whatever it takes to survive could one day be aimed at someone else. The Alliance proves nothing except that we share a common enemy for now. It is a pact of pure, cold pragmatism. There are no victory parades, no exchanges of cultural ambassadors. There is only a shared understanding that the convergence is a bigger problem than our mutual hatred. It is an alliance of convenience built on a foundation of corpses and barely contains suspicion. The future is a question mark. Our cooperation against the convergence works because the threat is clear and immediate. But what happens after? What happens if we win? Humanity is expanding rapidly, establishing colonies, reverse engineering our technology at a startling pace. They are no longer a contained planetary threat. They are a growing interstellar power with a proven capacity for ruthless, inventive warfare. Their long-term goals are unknown. Their trustworthiness is untested. The galaxy is now in a permanent state of strategic reassessment, forced to accommodate a power whose ultimate ambitions are a complete mystery. The resolution is a galactic contemplation with no easy answers. Did we force humanity to reveal a monstrous side of itself it had kept locked away? Did we force them to weaponize their entire civilization, awakening a militaristic and ruthless streak that will now define their future? Or was this always their true nature, lying dormant, a predator's patience waiting for a worthy challenge to finally emerge? The galaxy watches humanity master its new role, integrate its chaotic ingenuity with our orderly technology, and wonders which version of them we will see next. The benevolent ally or the extinction-level threat. The truth is, they are probably both. The only certainty is that the galactic community will never feel truly secure again. This uncertainty is the final, lingering cost of the war, a price we will continue to pay long after the last shot was fired. So the smile that ended the war wasn't about victory. It was about survival reconfigured as a permanent strategy. The lesson wasn't in their technology. It was in their mindset. True power isn't what you possess. It's what you do when you have nothing left to lose but your life. Adaptability became their ultimate weapon, and we were just the first to experience it. The galaxy watches them now, this new partner forged in desperation, and we all share the same unspoken question. Not what they were, what they will choose to become next. The view screen showed Walker-class units crushing human cities in hours. Then the first delivery truck exploded. Analyst Nex Lara's report changed everything. The most terrifying thing about humans is their adaptability. This is how Earth's logistics became weapons, and how a 57-year-old wildlife guide became the ghost of Yellowstone. Their intelligence was flawless. Perfect. The orbital scans showed no energy signatures above primitive combustion levels. Their dropships touched down without taking a single shot. Walker-class units marched through capital cities, their footfalls cracking ancient concrete, and met only scattered small arms fire that pinged harmlessly off their armor. We expected parades of tanks. We expected organized armies forming defensive lines across open ground. That's how war works. You find the enemy's force, you destroy it. You break their command structure. You secure the infrastructure. Their cities fell in hours, not days. Hours, London, Tokyo, New York. No coordinated counterattacks. No hidden defense grids activating. Our sensors mapped the entire planet and found nothing. No shielded bases. No reserve fleets. The initial assessment was unanimous. Total military dominance achieved. A textbook pacification. Command declared the planet secure after the first operational cycle. The occupation logistics teams began landing. They started setting up supply depots, command centers, habitation modules. The real work of integrating a new world into the hegemony. Then the first supply convoy hit an IED. It wasn't on a bridge or a narrow mountain pass. It was on a wide paved road 70 kilometers from the nearest conflict zone. A standard 6-vehicle column carrying nutrient paste and replacement parts. The lead vehicle was a repurposed human cargo truck, driven by a conscripted local. The explosion vaporized the first 2 vehicles and sent shrapnel through the next 3. The initial report blamed a malfunction, a vehicle accident, but the pattern repeated. A maintenance crew transporter disappeared. A patrol walker fell into a sinkhole that hadn't been on the maps. Their command structure, built for clear battlefields and known enemy formations, had no protocol for this. No front lines. No enemy uniforms. No declared war. The explosion from that first truck did more than destroy hardware. It shattered a fundamental assumption. Their victory wasn't being challenged by technology. It was being dismantled by imagination. The human weapon wasn't something we could scan for a shield against. It was their ability to look at a supply truck and see a bomb. To look at a road and see a trap. To look at their own subjugation and see an opportunity. We thought we were fighting soldiers. We were fighting a mindset, and we had no idea how to target that. Our sensors couldn't detect ingenuity. Our weapons couldn't target a concept. The war was about to change in ways our tactical manuals never predicted. The occupation was over. The real conflict had just begun, and it would be fought with the most terrifying weapons of all, whatever was lying around. The question wasn't how to build weapons. It was how to see the weapons already sitting in plain sight. The hegemony's occupation required a massive, complex supply chain, and they decided the most efficient solution was to use the existing human infrastructure. They saw delivery trucks as delivery trucks. They saw fuel tankers as fuel tankers. They were, in their hubris, completely blind to the fact they were commandeering an entire planet's worth of unregistered, undocumented, and now fully armed munitions. The first major incident wasn't another roadside bomb. It was inside a newly established processing compound. A shipment of industrial cleaning supplies, part of the standard sanitation protocol for a garrison of 3,000 troops. The scanners checked for radiation, for known explosive compounds. They passed inspection. The human workers unloaded the drums into a central storage bay. The chemical reaction began hours later, a delayed interaction between two seemingly inert substances. The resulting blast tore through half the base's temporary structures. The official report initially cited a faulty power cell. It took days to trace it back to the cleaning supplies. That was the pattern. A medical shipment would arrive. Our biosensors would confirm the contents matched the manifest. Painkillers, coagulants, antibiotics. They wouldn't detect the subtle alterations, the compounds added during the bottling process that, when metabolized by a hegemony physiology, acted as a potent neurotoxin. Soldiers would report for treatment and never walk out. A fuel tanker, one of thousands requisitioned to power our ground vehicles, would be fitted with a simple receiver, a child's toy remote, a modified cell phone. It would drive right up to the gates of a command center. Then it would cease to be a fuel tanker. It became a 15,000-gallon incendiary device, a firestorm contained within a metal shell waiting for a signal. The very vehicles we used to secure our perimeters became the things that breached them. Every civilian car on the road was a potential suicide vehicle. Every delivery of food was a potential poison. Every shipment of construction materials could be laced with chemical triggers. Our logistical network, the backbone of any military occupation, was systematically and invidiously turned against us. We weren't being attacked by an army. We were being attacked by our own supply lines. The resolution was a tactical nightmare. An ordinary delivery truck piloted by a terrified civilian we had conscripted at gunpoint could now inflict more damage than a company of human soldiers with rifles. The concept of a weapon of mass destruction was redefined. It no longer meant a planet-killer missile. It meant a flatbed truck carrying fertilizer and fuel oil, driven by a grandmother who knew exactly what would happen when she pressed the detonator switch hidden in her lunchbox. The battlefield was everywhere we had placed a resource. The enemy was everyone who handled that resource. We had to stop looking for soldiers and start looking at every single object, every single person, as a potential threat vector. This shift in perspective didn't come from our generals. It came from the ground up, from the survivors of these attacks. It came from watching an entire civilization turn its mundane, everyday machinery into an arsenal. The individuals behind these tactics weren't special forces. They were chemists, mechanics, truck drivers. They were the people we thought we had already conquered, and they were just getting started. The illusion of total control shattered further when command received reports of losses in Wyoming. Not from a city, not from a convoy, from a national park. The initial scans showed nothing but geothermal activity and wildlife. Green lights across the board. A low-priority sector designated for later resource extraction. Patrols were sent in to establish a perimeter sensor net. They did not come out. The first search party vanished. The second search party found the first one's walker partially submerged in a hot spring, its cockpit pried open, the crew gone. They attributed it to a mechanical fault, a tragic accident in difficult terrain. Then the third patrol went silent after reporting unnatural fog that blinded their sensors. Jackson Wade was a 57-year-old wildlife guide. No military record, no advanced training. His file, pulled from a local database, listed him as a park employee specializing in bear safety and backcountry navigation. He knew the Yellowstone caldera better than any living human. He knew which limestone caves could hide a man's heat signature from orbital thermal scans. He knew how the sulfur vents could fog seismic readers, making a company of men sound like a bison herd. He knew the precise mineral composition of the soil that would turn to slick, impassable mud under the weight of a walker's foot after a brief afternoon shower. His ambushes weren't attacks. They were environmental events. He'd wait for a patrol to traverse a narrow trail above a gorge. He wouldn't shoot at them. He'd use a few precisely placed charges to trigger a rock slide behind them, cutting off retreat. Then he'd use a long pole to crack the thin, brittle crust of a geothermal pool in front of them. The walkers, boxed in, would panic. One wrong step off the stable path and a 50-ton machine would plunge into boiling acidic water, its armor dissolving in minutes. He used animal migration paths to predict patrol routes, knowing the aliens would follow the paths of least resistance. He used the park's own weather, the sudden violent storms, to mask his movements completely. The adaptability was the first marker. It wasn't just that humans were creative. It was the speed. A new hegemony countermeasure would be deployed on Monday. By Wednesday, humans had developed 3 different ways to bypass it. Bypass the bypass and use the countermeasure itself as a component in a new weapon. Their tactics evolved not in years but in hours. It was a constant, terrifying escalation with no visible ceiling. Their potential seemed biologically unlimited. The casualty reports were even more disturbing. The hegemony lost millions, but humanity lost far more, and it didn't matter. They showed no sign of breaking, no inclination to negotiate a surrender. Their willingness to absorb catastrophic losses wasn't a strategy. It was a fundamental condition of their existence. It suggested a mindset where survival wasn't about preserving life, but about denying victory to the enemy no matter the price. This existential approach to conflict was something the galaxy's rules of war had never accounted for. It was a form of mutually assured destruction practiced by a species that hadn't even achieved interstellar travel. The real fear was the spread. The Council watched human tactics and saw a virus. Guerrilla warfare, psychological operations, the weaponization of everyday life. These were concepts that could be uploaded, taught, and replicated. A oppressed miner on some distant colony world could watch footage from Earth, download a text file on making explosives from cleaning supplies, and suddenly become a massive security threat. Human methods didn't require advanced technology. They required only will and knowledge. If these ideas took root elsewhere, the entire established order of the galaxy, built on clear hierarchies and measurable military power, could collapse into chaos. The quarantine decision was not a military tactic. It was a containment protocol, Class 5 extinction threat. The designation was reserved for cosmic hazards, rogue singularities, bioweapons of unimaginable scope. They gave it to a planet of apes who had just discovered radio. The classification wasn't about the weapons humans had now. It was about the pattern they represented. Their unpredictability was the threat. You could defeat an army. You could bomb a city. How do you defeat a species that turns your own food, your own tools, your own children's toys into instruments of your destruction? You can't. You can only hope to contain it. The resolution was a galactic admission of defeat. The hegemony hadn't just failed to conquer Earth. They had accidentally introduced the galaxy to a new, terrifyingly unpredictable variable. The strategic reassessment was not about how to win the war. It was about how to prevent it from infecting the entire galaxy. The calculus of power had just been permanently altered, so they sat down and crunched the numbers. The final report made for grim reading. 9 million soldiers lost, not wounded, killed in action. 37 capital ships destroyed or mission killed, their hulls burning in low orbit or scuttled after catastrophic internal sabotage. Those weren't casualties. They were an industrial cost. And the projection for year 2 of the occupation was worse. Far worse. The curve didn't flatten. It went vertical. They were looking at the complete annihilation of their expeditionary force within another 18 months, with nothing to show for it but a higher body count. Victory was mathematically impossible. They weren't being defeated. They were being bled dry. Conventional solutions had all failed. Orbital bombardment was useless against an enemy with no central infrastructure. Sending in more walkers just created more targets for improvised terrain traps. Increasing security around supply convoys simply meant the resistance would attack something else, something softer. They were playing a game of whack-a-mole where the moles had rewired the mallet to explode. Every military doctrine, every standard operating procedure, every tactical manual written over 10,000 years of interstellar conquest was obsolete. They were fighting an enemy that refused to follow the rules of war because it had never read them. The economic cost became the central argument. The treasury ministers back on the homeworld started sending increasingly frantic memos. The occupation of Earth was consuming the GDP of 3 core systems. They weren't gaining resources. They were incinerating them. The war was a financial black hole with no end in sight. Polls showed public support collapsing as casualty lists mounted, and tax revenues were diverted to fund a conflict that looked less like a conquest and more like a collective suicide pact. Political pressure sealed it. The Galactic Security Council's Class 5 extinction threat designation wasn't just a label. It was a warning to every other species. It turned a regional conflict into a galactic security crisis. Other powers started applying sanctions. They threatened to embargo hegemony shipping lanes. They questioned the stability of the entire regime. The political cost of continuing the war became higher than the cost of admitting defeat. They weren't just losing on the ground. They were losing their standing in the interstellar community, and through it all the humans kept fighting. 1 billion dead. 1 billion. a number so large it should have broken any civilization. It didn't even slow them down. The resistance grew stronger, more inventive, more vicious with every passing month. Their will wasn't being broken. It was being tempered. They were willing to sacrifice their entire species rather than submit. That level of commitment is something you can't bomb into submission. You can only stand in awe of it or get out of its way. The resolution was a simple, brutal cost-benefit analysis. Annihilation was not a victory condition. It was just annihilation. There was no scenario where they won. There were only scenarios where they lost less. An alliance, as insane as it sounded, was the option that promised the smallest losses. It was the only move left on the board that wasn't a form of slow, expensive suicide. They chose survival over pride. They chose a negotiated peace over a futile annihilation. This decision, born of pure pragmatism, would soon be validated by a threat that made the human resistance look like a minor border skirmish. A threat that didn't want to conquer territory. A threat that consumed it. The new threat arrived without warning. No declarations of war, no demands for surrender. The first system to go silent was a hegemony mining colony on the edge of explored space. The final transmission was a garbled scream of conflicting sensor data and a psychic echo of pure, undiluted hunger. They called it the Convergence. It wasn't an empire. It wasn't a civilization. It was an ecological disaster with starships, a predator species that didn't conquer territory. It consumed it. Whole biospheres were stripped bare, leaving behind dead rock and silence. Their ships weren't built. They were grown. Organic vessels that shrugged off plasma cannons and energy weapons like rain. Their armor adapted, regenerated. Our most powerful beams were absorbed, dissipated. They were immune to our entire arsenal. But their real weapon was psychic. It wasn't communication. It was domination. A convergence ship would broadcast a wave of psychic static that scrambled neural pathways. Hegemony crews would turn on each other. Commanders would issue suicidal orders. Navigation officers would plot courses directly into stars. Our command and control, the pride of our fleet, became our greatest vulnerability. They didn't need to break our shields. They just made us lower them ourselves. Our entire military doctrine was useless. You can't fight an enemy that lives inside the minds of your soldiers. The threat was existential for both sides. The Convergence didn't care about treaties or borders. It saw the hegemony and humanity as two separate biomass deposits. It would consume us both. The war for Earth was a territorial dispute. The war against the Convergence was a fight for the right to exist. We faced total annihilation, not conquest, erasure, and neither of us could fight it alone. Our technology was ineffective. Our tactics were obsolete. Our soldiers were vulnerable to the psychic onslaught. The humans were losing colonies too. Their outposts on the frontier vanished. But they were fighting back. And they were having unexpected successes. We detected a lone human corvette, a scavenged hegemony design they'd heavily modified, engaging a convergent scout. Our sensors watched, expecting the human ship to be torn apart. It wasn't. They used kinetic weapons. Simple, chemically propelled projectiles. The kind we'd abandoned millennia ago. The Convergence's bioshields, designed to dissipate energy, were useless against solid mass. The scout ship ruptured, spilling its organic contents into the void. They'd found a weakness we hadn't even thought to look for.